Bam.
Hi, I'm Jim Chapman, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
This is going to be a fun adventure for all of us. Jim has a great job. He collects and curates and displays the history of baseball through pictures, ancient pictures. And I say ancient, as ancient as pictures can be. And what a fantastic thing. And I got to point out that our buddy Greg is here, and Greg paints paintings from a lot of these pictures and does just incredible work. And I'll put links up to both these guys and stuff so you can check them out. But thanks to the both of you for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me back, Pete.
How did you get into this? Like, this is a very niche-y kind of thing to get into.
I started out and I came back, probably about 10 or 15 years ago. And my sister had given me for Christmas a baseball card book of the Cracker Jack baseball cards from 1914. And, I was kind of interested in flipping through and looking at that and looking at the wonderful artwork on those. And then, kind of reattaching to the hobby, I came across some of the photographs that were actually used to produce those cards. And I was like, wow, these just really speak to me of this era. That was one of the biggest changes in the Deadball Era, 1900, 1920, really the formation of modern baseball. And it was just fascinating to me seeing these actual images that I had no idea, still existed in the wild, so to speak.
Yeah. Do you still get excited when you find a new undiscovered picture, whether it's connected to a known image that's something else, or is that still exciting for you?
That still is a thrill for me. And probably what is a bigger thrill, and Greg kind of shares this with his artistry of doing the research, and sometimes seeing a photo and trying to figure out what is depicted, and sometimes, trying to figure out to put it in the historical context. A lot of times I can place it down to the exact game, inning, location. And, it's really kind of fascinating digging out some stories that are, hitherto unknown, that can be revealed by examination of the photos. So yes, that's still very much the thrill of the chase, and the chase of knowledge is, everyone enjoys a great, Ty Cobb photo portrait, but that's self-evident what it is. Sometimes I'm more thrilled by a little bit more obscure and doing the research.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to make Greg. For those of you who don't know, Greg is an amazing painter. We had him on before with Dave Hobrecht, who also is an amazing artist. You guys both use baseball as one of their main canvases. When you find a great new photo, what does that mean to you? Like, what does that look like? What do you see that you go, oh, I have to paint this?
I mean, Jim is probably the same way in this. Like, you see a photo or any number of photos, and it, like he said, for me, it doesn't have to be a Babe Ruth or a Lou Gehrig. You just see something that catches your eye, whether it's a look on a player's face or a composition of a certain ballpark. In my case, it's usually some sort of quality of light thing. I mean, I usually want to stop whatever it is that I'm doing and just kind of start working on a painting of that, even though it's not a commission or not related to anything. It's just like, oh my God, I just want to, it's like I want to share it with other people, but at the same time, I want to share my interpretation of it. But I know, like the way, like when Jim and I get together and we see each other pretty much every year at the National, the way we talk about some of the photos, like the nuance and all the weird stuff that we get into, it's very exciting. I love it, at least.
Yeah, I mean, Greg gets down to the nap on a sweater. I had him do a painting of Chief Bender that you can see on his website, and he's wearing this fantastic blue sweater with the knobby with little, and he would get down to even trying to figure out what the little ribbon hanging from it was, and doing the research and trying to get the color just right, and checking with the Hall of Fame. Okay, this was a dark blue. What shade of blue was this? He was just impeccable taste and immaculate in his research.
Oh, well, I mean, you're just saying that because it was a painting for you. But the good
doesn't hurt, but but you take that to all your work, though. That's what is so impressive.
That's true. But the good thing about it, and having a client like Jim, is that I can tell him, I'm obsessing about this particular thing, and he totally gets it. He totally understands it. He picks up on why that is important to the to the integrity of the photo and everything.
When you're looking for a particular kind of blue and the Hall of Fame's trying to communicate it, are you guys using Pantone numbers? Are they saying, oh, it's a light periwinkle? How do they even communicate that with you?
You know,
Oh, either one.
I mean, just looking at it, because we went back and forth, and what we would actually do is find newspaper.com articles describing the sweaters and describing it as a Navy. And the Hall of Fame has, one of those sweaters, but it's 100 years old, and how much age toning has gone in. It's really hard to say what it looked like, when it was fresh and in the day.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got one of my grandfather's football jerseys from 1940, probably one. And it's beautiful. It's just kind of maybe a burgundy kind of color with these numbers. And the numbers aren't white anymore, but they probably were. And you look at that thing, and it speaks to me. Look, it's my grandfather's. Maybe it wouldn't speak to somebody else, but there's something about that thing. It has a story that I'm trying to hear, and maybe I'm trying to write it or think about how to tell a story about that team or whatever. But what do you guys hear when you see these pictures? I mean, we know that pictures talk to us. I mean, we all experience that. But what is that like for you guys?
Oh man, Jim. Jim, you got to tell them about the Ruth postcard. I mean, that encapsulates everything as far as I'm concerned.
And what he's referring to is I, discovered and was able to establish a 1914 postcard that depicts Babe Ruth on the mound in Fenway Park in his second ever major league game. And to date, I think that is the only printed image of him in the big leagues in 1914. He only appeared in 4 games. And basically the research involved was on the Fenway scoreboard. The players did not have numbers in those days. And that was a couple of decades later before you started seeing numbers. But you'd look up there and they had the pitcher and the catcher, and it'd have a number, 3-digit or 2-digit. And what you do is you look in the scorebook and you would see, Babe Ruth, 171, or any other player. So that was how you kind of identified who the player was. And actually working with the Hall of Fame and tracking down programs from that game, I was actually able to establish that is indeed Babe Ruth on the mound, even though he's ant-sized when you look at the picture. There's no way you can just visually identify him, but you can conclusively prove. And so that's what I say, the thrill of the chase and finding something historically significant of seeing Babe Ruth on the field in his second ever major league game was just utterly fascinating to me and going through that process.
But Jim's also not giving himself enough credit here, because one of the problems that I think that I run into and that I know that he runs into is that you're dealing with such minutia in those photographs. So, he's looking at what the Fenway Park scoreboard says or what the ads say. And, you can talk to people at the Hall of Fame. They can help you. And I'm not talking smack about the Hall of Fame, but they don't necessarily know, the lengths that you're going to. So the information that you're looking for is not necessarily stuff that they're going to have a lot of the time. So you're really you're digging in the dirt by yourself in a lot of ways. You're just looking for nuggets of truth that you can find here and there, whether it's from the Hall or newspapers.com or whatever. And I remember when Jim had first contacted me about the postcard, and I was like, I have this postcard, Ruth, second game in 1914, and he sent me this whole treatise of how he came to that conclusion. It's all of the evidence is there, and he knew how to find it. It's he knew where he had to dig, and he knew what he was looking for. And I think he's great at doing that with a lot of the images that he has. I mean, you can see that stuff on his website. A lot of those, whether they're old postcards or photographs, snapshots of games, he has it down to a specific day or a specific series. He's a man after my own heart. What can I say?
To your point, Greg, the Hall of Fame didn't even realize that program was from Babe Ruth's game. They knew they had a 1914 program with, Detroit in town, but I was able to look at the box scores and be able to, to figure out. And I actually told the Hall of Fame, you actually have, this program is actually of historical significance. It's Babe Ruth's second game. And they didn't fully appreciate that, I think, at the time.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the original premise of my question too. And Greg, you write in the gist and say, you stare into these people's faces, and they are communicating something to you. And it's your job to sort it out. Maybe it's light periwinkle blue or whatever it is, but it's not just in the gnat and the nits and the little crag in the face. It's other stuff. So what do you hear when you're painting? Or is it just mechanical for you? Maybe I'm putting too much into the magic of photos.
No, I mean, it's both. I mean, there's a mechanical part of it, a technical part of it that I'm just trying to kind of think about while I'm painting. But at the same time, there is the intangible part of, trying to kind of put yourself in the moment for me. If it's a photograph of I don't know, just a random, Yankee from the mid-20s, if it's taken by Charles Conlon, then, I'm trying to imagine Conlon himself kind of being on the sidelines at Yankee Stadium, on the third base side, which is where the Yankees had their dugout in those days. And, I'm thinking, okay, this is probably overcast light, and, wondering like what the crowd is sounding like, wondering what the weather is like. That's kind of what I get out of it. I mean, I'm also kind of weird, so there's that. But I would imagine that Jim also puts himself in kind of the same space.
I do, and to your question, and I think Greg and I are similar on this. That, as I mentioned, when I first got back into collecting photographs, I started out by looking at the baseball cards. And for me, baseball cards were the beautiful pastels. They weren't using the actual images; they were lithographic, prints of the images. And they be against the red background, unnatural backgrounds, but beautiful. And as I said, those were a beautiful daydream. Every little boy that collected baseball cards could someday envision themselves on the mound as a big league pitcher, rearing back to throw. But when I first saw the photographs are not a daydream, they're actually a time machine, that they convey you back to that moment in time. You feel like you were there. You see the dirt and grime on the cap. You see the weather-beaten faces of the players. You can identify aspects of the stadium, and it actually transports you back in time. And for me, that's the beauty of the photographs. Greg, I would say his immense skill is, we all have seen a lot of baseball paintings, and quite frankly, a lot of them aren't that good. That they're a likeness, and you appreciate it, but they're more like abstract. Whereas I think Greg's painting and his attention to detail and the play of light, he's not a daydream painter. He is actually a time machine portal himself. And the way he can create his art and transport you back, that you feel like you were staring Chief Bender in the eye, Side Park during the 1911 World Series. And he's just got an incredible talent. And everyone I've shown his image is like, wow, this guy is a true artist. How in the world is he able to accomplish that?
Oh,
and so I think that's the talent, and I think that's kind of the carryover of the photographs. We're both searching in our work. He's obviously much more talented. I can just research it; he can do it. But it's fascinating to me that just from the artistic side there.
If I can do it, but it's debatable to me whether I do it. But that's very nice of you to say.
Whenever I see
a lot of your paintings, as you mentioned, a lot of them use photographs as the basis for the paintings. Do you ever just create a painting out of your mind's eye, or do you usually have a photograph that you are basing it off of?
Well, I used to, when I was, I hate saying this, when I was younger. By younger, I mean like in my 20s, when I was first kind of starting doing this stuff, I would make kind of composites and kind of create my own scene. But as I got older, and I guess more kind of obsessed with everything, and I mean certainly obsessed with the quality of the paintings, even though I was already obsessed about that, but I got even more obsessed. I found that in those paintings, the ones that I kind of composited from other images, I had a hard time thinking that they were convincing and that they worked as paintings. And I think it's because I just became so familiar with the fact that I took DiMaggio from this photograph, and I took Yankee Stadium from that photograph, and Bob Fellers from this other one. And to me, it's like I always felt like it was like a sham in a way. And I don't know why, but to this day, it's still like that. I still kind of feel like whenever I do that, it's not quite right. And I think maybe a lot of that just has to do with the fact that I'm so kind of trained by examining those photographs so intensely, and it's kind of hard to change them. Even if there's something in a painting that I want to kind of change a little bit, if it's just kind of something small that I think will make the painting better, take a little artistic license, it still doesn't feel right. But again, a lot of that is like my mental illness.
Yeah, because Dave Hobrecht has no problem at all inventing
Right.
a reality, right? We talked about this when we had the two of you. By the way, great episode between you and Dave. For Jim's sake, I don't know if you've seen Dave's work, but he does charcoal or he does pastels, and he'll take Vin Scully, Jackie Robinson, a new player, and then combine two stadiums together, like Ebbets Field and Dodger Stadium, maybe even have a splash of LA Coliseum. And you look at it and you cannot take your eyes off of it. It's amazing what he does. And so it is interesting to compare and contrast the permission you guys give yourselves to do what you do. And yet both of you guys do beautiful, amazing things.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Dave's wonderful. He does great stuff.
Yeah. Have you seen Dave's work at all, Jim?
I have not, only in passing. I think I've seen it mentioned, but I have not done any kind of in-depth dive into it.
Yeah, it's incredible. We're not going to talk about screw Dave. We're not talking about Dave today.
Dave's a good guy.
Yeah, Dave's a super good guy. He is. So when we're talking about all this stuff and the creation and the research and everything else. Oh, forget that. I got a question. So I'm going to bring Dave back in. Dave asked Greg a great question. He's like, how many half done or mistake paintings do you have laying around in your studio? And it was a great question because only an artist can really ask another artist that. So we'll ask you, how many pictures are sitting there in some stage of either it's stuck or I haven't had time? I mean, you must have a zillion pictures that are waiting to be realized.
I mean,
I was going to ask that to Jim, but either way.
That was to Jim. I'm sorry. No. Then
yeah. No, but I'll come back to you.
No. Go to Jim. I'm sorry.
I have a lot of photographs that I, have acquired, saying, okay, I'm very curious as to what this contains, and just getting the time to getting around to research them and do them. Yeah. And, I've probably got dozens that I could dig in a little bit deeper to be able to try to find the story on.
Yeah. When do you know when that story is done?
When usually it's when I can find some newspaper confirmation. Like I have a 1912 World Series postcard in Fenway Park. And, I finally was able to find a newspaper that went play by play. And, I was able to identify, okay, this is Gardner stroking a triple down the right field line. And having all the players on the field, all the positions, everything match up perfectly with that description, detailed description in the newspaper. Because so often you just get a snippet of, Gardner tripled. It doesn't say he tripled, past the bag, past the diving first baseman, which when you can get visual confirmation of the words in the story, you go, eureka, I have hit it, I've nailed, I know exactly what this entails. My research is done, other than if I can find an exact image of that published with a caption, saying it even better. But usually you're going to be left just trying to find the description, contemporary inscription that matches. Yeah.
Greg, we'll ask you the question. Things that are laying around that are in some stage of not begun, not done.
Oh man, I have a lot. I mean, same thing with me that Jim has, where the research kind of takes a hold of you and requires a lot of energy to be put into it. But for me, also, it's just actually physically painting. But if I was, I can't believe that this is true, but if I'm telling you that I have over, 50 or 60 paintings, in various states of completion here in the studio, it's not a lie. It's a little insane. What happens when you have kids? You just, can't do any work.
Yeah. Do you paint yourself into a corner though? I mean, like, do you ever just fully get stuck?
You mean physically? because that
I mean, like, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, there are times when, you know, I work on a piece and I need a break from it, or times when I work on a piece and I'm like, well, I don't know if this is right. I don't know if this detail is the right, you know, color or whatever. I'm trying to do more research, and I'll put it aside. And sometimes I put it aside for months. Unfortunately, sometimes it gets put aside for years. But also, you know, being painted into a corner, literally, physically, like the studio, the walking space in the studio, it's like prime real estate, and it's just like a very small, thin path to the easel. It's really dangerous.
No, I appreciate you talking about that, because you know, you're so prolific. At least I think you're prolific. I mean, you constantly got new photos I've not seen, and I've been on your website a bunch, just looking around and just being gobsmacked. Whenever you put a photo out that I haven't seen, I'm always zooming in, and it's amazing to me the detail that you can get. And it's a tiny detail, but you just get so many, like the faces, you know, aren't just like always like a blob of like two black dots and some tan, you know, like you really do an amazing job of zooming in, and then you look back with perspective and it all makes sense. It blows me away, man. It's incredible.
Oh, thank you. I mean, honestly, all that credit goes to the photographers. I mean, sure, I'm painting, but without those photographers, I mean, you know, like the people that Jim, you know, became intimately aware of, you know, for his book, it's like I can't do that stuff without them. So I kind of feel like I'm just maybe like a conduit for continuing that in a way.
Greg, what does the client participation feel like for most of your paintings? Do you almost exclusively do all the artistic decisions, or do you use client feedback of what aspects of a painting appeal to them, or highlighting? I mean, do you shift that around a little bit depending on the client and the situation? Or?
I mean, the way you and I talk, I ideally I would like that with everyone, but it's just different with each person. I mean, like, you know, you and I can go back and forth and talk about that stuff and point out things and enjoy, you know, enjoy a relationship. But there's some clients, and not to say that this is bad, but there's some clients who are just kind of like, you know, I'll write like a couple of paragraphs about what it is I'm going through, and, you know, what I love about this image, and yada yada, and, you know, their response will just be like, "Cool, I like it," and that's it, you know. And, you know, it's like eventually you go through a bunch of emails like that, and eventually they get their painting, and you never hear from them again, and that's fine. I mean, that's just how it is. But yeah, ideally, if I could have the relationship, like one that I have with you, if I could have that with all of my clients, that would be really cool.
Let's talk about your book, Jim, because you guys both have books. So let's talk about yours and the mechanics of going through it, and how on earth do you decide so this thing isn't like 400 pages big or something?
It's 392, so it's almost 400 big. You know, and you're right. Yes, that's the critical thing of when do you decide you are finished? And like, okay, you could incrementally be adding to it, learning more, but at a certain point you say, you know, I've done 99% of what I can do, and we're going to call it good for the day. So that the creative process was very interesting on going through and doing that. And I knew early on that, you know, I had never written a book before. You know, collected the photographs, passionate about it. And people always ask me, well, did you approach a publisher and get rejected? And I said, no, I never. I knew from the get-go that this was going to be a self-published book. I said, can you imagine me going to a publisher, even a small publisher, and saying, my day job is I'm a judge. I've never written a book or never been a writer. I want to write about obscure, unknown photographers in the deadball era of baseball that many baseball fans don't even know what it is. And I want it to be coffee table size on quality paper. And I want it to sell for 65 to 75. And I want to print at least 1,000 copies of it. Would you be interested? Oh, and by the way, I want total editorial control, design of the dust jacket. I don't want any input. I just want to give you the finished product and have you print it. And I recognized pretty early on, that's not likely to happen. that someone's going to take that chance on me. So I said, okay. I knew from day one it was going to be a turnkey in-house job. That myself, I would write it, and my wife and my niece would help edit it. So no professional help at all. So. But that made it a lot more fun. As I said, I'm going to sink or swim based on my own efforts on this.
Yeah. Has it been, do you care if it does well? I mean, like, is that part of the process, or is this made just so that it's made and exists?
I'm actually pleasantly surprised. I think the interesting thing is, and people tell me, is my passion for the subject was able to kind of come through the book, that people reading the book kind of get that feel. So when I went in, honestly, my goal was to just not lose money doing it. It was a passion project. Unfortunately, I'm in the black, and as my wife says, you can't retire on your earnings from that book. Keep your day job. Don't get any funny ideas on becoming a professional writer. But no, I was surprised, and I was fortunate enough that it finished second in the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of the Year, and won the Larry Ritter Award from Sabre for the Best Deadball Book of the Year. So I had no expectation of receiving the critical praise that it did, and by non-photo collectors, this in the literary and baseball world. So I was pleasantly surprised by the reception of the book.
No, that's great. I'll take over here for a second and do my job and talk about how great that book is. And so look, if you guys want to buy it on Amazon, you can. Maybe I'll get a couple of coins. Forget that. Go to the website, and I'm going to put that link up right here. And look, if you can't find this, you know how to search things yourself. But go to the actual Chapman collection site. The book is prominent there, and you can get it for less money than you get it on Amazon. I wouldn't get a taste of that, and that's fine. I'd rather you guys just buy it. You can get a signed copy for less money than what it is on Amazon, or go to Amazon and buy it. Either way, it is wonderful. It's gorgeous, and you want to get this book. And you know what I always say? Buy two. Because one gift is good, but two gifts are better. And any baseball person is going to love this thing. So that's what you do. You go to Jim's website and you get his book. And we'll talk about Greg's book here in a second. But right now we're talking about Jim's book. Go get that thing. All right.
I think you should just stick with Jim's book, because I mean, my book it's my book, but it's not really my book. But Jim's book was like an absolute tour de force as far as I'm concerned. I mean, there haven't been many books that, there are obviously a ton of books on baseball photography and baseball photographers, but Jim's was, I think, the first in its scope to really dive into it, not only as kind of as a hobby, but also I think giving people, a different way of looking at this stuff, and a different way of thinking about it. In the book, everything that Jim has written has been great, and he had friends helping him out with giving him scans of images, and whether he has people writing forwards to the book, like Paul Reeferson, and you have Henry Yee in there. Like, these are all, when it comes to photography, baseball photography in like the collecting space, these are titans. I mean, they might not necessarily be known to a random fellow down the street, but he's getting the most, I don't know, compelling information about this subject and putting it into a very digestible form. And his passion, I agree 100% that his passion does come through in it. And the fact that he kind of, spearheaded the whole thing and, made it his project to not only, put out something. It was never about money. I never thought it was about money with him. It was always kind of like telling the best story and, giving photographers and the whole idea of collecting photographs and learning about them, giving them their due. And that, I mean, that's why I love the book as much as I do. I mean, like, everyone that I've spoken to who has any kind of appreciation for baseball history, I suggest it to. And Jim is not paying me anything to say this. It's true.
Jim, by the way, you just sold a copy of the book. You tell your wife to stuff it. Pete Turner just bought one of your books. We're going to get you retired on this thing. Literally, I did while Greg was talking. I'm like, all right, let me finish up buying this thing, because I knew Greg had a good long answer for us. So,
sorry.
Anybody else, again, buy this book. It's going to be gorgeous. You're going to love it. Great. Jim. Oh, hold on. I had put you on mute. Sorry about that.
Okay, go ahead.
No, that's it. Yeah, I'm throwing it over to you.
Okay. Yeah, actually, to me, the fascinating thing on the book is there's lots of picture books about baseball. You see, those are a dime a dozen out there. But to me, it was using the images, and that's chock full of hundreds of images, but telling the story behind the images, but telling the story of these photographers, the men who made the baseball stars famous by plastering their pictures all over the newspaper. But by and large, even collectors had no idea who was behind the lens and taking the images. And their stories are pretty fascinating, in and of themselves. Like Charles Conlon that Greg mentioned, he's probably the greatest baseball photographer of all time. And he was a proofreader for a New York newspaper. That was his day job, was proofreading. He would go out, the editor asked him just to go out with a camera one day in 1904 to the Polo Grounds. And his first picture is of Christy Mathewson. And he developed these real relationship with the players. Before that time, it was studio photography. The players put on their Sunday best or their crisp, clean, white uniform, and they went and posed in a static environment in a well-lit studio, and the photographer would airbrush out their blemishes, very much a 1800s, 1890s cabinet card look. And it was really some of these photographers like Conlon and Francis Burke, Louis Van Owen, that would take the camera onto the field. Conlon, developed these relationships with the players so that they became comfortable with him. And you see some of the relaxed and intent, even images, that he took, eyes on. And that was them getting to know him and trust him and kind of capturing in their natural environment. And so that story had really been untold. We all saw the images of all the famous ball players, but we didn't know the context of how and why those pictures came into being.
Yeah, so we had Andy Friedman on the show, not the Dodgers GM or director of baseball operations, whatever his title is, but the photographer who's like the NBA's main photographer. He sets up all the shots. He also has done stuff for Major League Baseball. And when Kirk Gibson hits his home run, there's Andy, and he's got to run to a spot to find the picture. And, there's a couple versions of that picture because there's more than one person out there doing that job. But it's funny, while everybody else is losing their minds, he's losing his mind running onto the field to capture. And I think he gets the shot coming down third base when you see Kirk's mouth open and he's about to hit his teammates. And it's a wonderful picture. And so that skill to know how to do that goes all the way back to Conlon, I guess, then gaining access, right?
I mean, those photographers brought the game, as I call it, from bringing the field to the fans. And Paul Referson makes this excellent point that prior to about 1920, you really don't have any significant on-field incidents or famous moments that are captured on there. Most of them are taken before the game or not game action shots. And after 1920, almost every significant historical event has been captured on film. But these guys were kind of the precursors of the modern day sports photography. We're so used to getting an image of any and everything that happened. And prior to 1900, you would see a woodcut of a player in the newspaper. You wouldn't even actually know what your heroes look like. That they were in the myth creating business of having images that people around the country could actually see these players firsthand, see what the stadiums looked like. And it was introducing the game to the country, because if you think about it, in 1900, there was a very narrow band from, New England down through the Midwest, to maybe the St. Louis, that if you lived close to there, you could make it to the stadium and see the major leagues. Other than that, you were just reading about it in the newspaper or watching your local town team. And the newspapers and these imagery really introduced all these teams in the major leagues to the public at large in the first 2 decades.
One of the things that's go ahead, Greg.
I was going to say, well, that's also one of the great things about what Jim studies and what his book presents to you is that it makes you realize that you can see footage of Barry Bonds hitting a home run, and you can get photographs of it from every conceivable angle. And even though baseball is kind of the most visually represented sport that we have, it wasn't always like that. It had very humble beginnings, and it's amazing to kind of get an education as to kind of where that kind of came from and how that started.
I mentioned in the book that there's only a lot of these images, there's probably less than a half dozen. Many of them are just one that are still out there. And that makes it, tough for, because Greg concentrates a lot of his painting in those early days. But unless you're dealing with a superstar, he probably has less than a dozen images of most players that he wants to paint to choose from. It's not like he's got an endless supply. So, he has to be very selective, but not too selective, just given the quantity out there.
A lot of times when you're an artist, whether you're painting or you're taking a photograph, you're trying to capture a moment, and oftentimes we're not quite pleased with how we captured it, whether it's in words or whatever it is. And so you have to know these photographers are like, oh man, I was a beat too slow, or I couldn't advance the film fast enough. Do you have any remnants of people saying, this is a good photo, but the one I needed to get was 10 seconds earlier?
Probably the most famous baseball photograph from that era, or maybe even any era, is Ty Cobb sliding into third base, flying. And, the story there is that Conlon was on the third base line taking that photo or series of photos, and that play ensuingly knocked him down, knocked the camera out of his hands. And he didn't know till he got back to the studio that he had actually gotten that shot. That's, now they do it with Zoom. You don't have photographers on the ground, but they, in that point in time, circa 1910, they were literally, just feet from the fair baseway there.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear that. And you think about all those guys who got waylaid by the play that happens right then. I mean, the dirt and the clearness of it. It is a remarkable picture.
Yeah, think about where the photographers were also, around kind of home plate. An errant foul could end their lives, basically. You don't have that now.
One of my favorite shots from that era is from Fenway's opening in 1912 during the World Series during its first year. And then, in the book and on the website, you can see images of that. There are a whole gaggle of photographers sitting on top of the roof of Fenway, not in a press box. I mean, literally on the roof, legs dangling over the side. Can you imagine in today's age of having photographers perched on the roof, leaning over to take images?
Yeah, that's crazy when you think about that. I mean, isn't Vince Scully, isn't his first gig? Isn't he at Fenway on top of there in his shirt sleeves in a snowstorm or something like impossible like that?
Something like that. Talking about the wind or whatever. Yeah, something like that.
That's crazy. Yeah. So when you're managing your collection and someone's like, hey, we got a bunch of old photos, grandpops passed away, we'd like to get them to you. Is that a gift? Do you buy them? How does that part work?
That's actually a little bit more uncommon than you think. I've had it happen a couple of times. And that was the old way of collecting. Probably 30 or 40 years ago, it was players' families or news photographers that had those in their collections and would, be willing to part with them to collectors. So although that's drying up to some extent, over time, that really where the bulk, for most of the collectors, you're buying online on auction houses or on eBay or, going to some of the shows and finding them. But the true source is these were never intended to be distributed to the public at large. Like baseball cards came in packs of cigarettes or gum. They were intended, the consumer was the ultimate user of it. On these photographs, they were really working pieces that were mailed out by the photographers and by the photo agencies to all the periodicals and newspapers. And they would reproduce them and either send them back to the photographer or put them in their file and a story on it. And it was really in the 1990s that as newspapers started to be digitized, that you would get some of these big newspapers and small, medium-sized ones that would liquidate. They basically tell someone, okay, if you digitize my images, I'll just give you my collection. They didn't really realize what the value of some of these images were. And so a lot of these images over the hobby has really come into being in the last 30 years as these images have poured into the market from those archives. And right now, there's not that many new ones coming out. The New York Times still has their archive. The Chicago Tribune still has it. There's still some major ones out there, but I think at this point in time, they all realize, hey, this is actually a valuable asset. that we're holding on to here. So I think you're going to see that slow down to a trickle comparatively to where it was, a decade ago.
Yeah. And how many of these photo collections just became trash when Grandpaps passed? And it's like, we just don't need this old china, this old silver, and this old box of photos, and
I think it's like your mom and the baseball cards. I think you're going to have more of those stories than you would think. Because if you think about it, these massive collections took up a lot of storage space, and newspapers were tired of paying a warehouse to house these images that they were saying, we're never going to use this again. A minor player that died 110 years ago, when's he going to be in the news? That's just dead weight. So yes, I'm afraid a lot of them probably just got trashed or burned. And I know a lot of the negatives. There's stories of some of the famous photographers that their negatives just being destroyed, either by themselves or by, the news agencies or their heirs. They're just not really appreciating the significance and value.
It makes me think that maybe that's where the original term of having a photo morgue came from. It's like the photos go into file cabinets and then you never see them again. So, but I think about that stuff a lot. I know Jim does too. Thinking about the stuff that has been thrown away, stuff that we'll never see. And I get depressed, but I guess also got to be grateful for what we do have.
And Greg, I know you're in the New York area. Do you ever get to go in to see any of the archives and look for photos or images?
No, it's been a dream of mine to do that with the Times, and they keep, at least the Times, they keep it pretty private. So I've never been able to do anything like that. But Jim's right. I mean, there a lot of those sources have dried up, especially like in the last 10, 15 years. And a lot of those kind of sources have, the photos or the negatives or whatever have been like dispersed throughout the country and to different collectors. And, some of them are never seen again. Some of them turn up on auction, and you can kind of piece it together, but it's not like seeing everything in like one place. It just doesn't really happen like that anymore, unfortunately.
Well, and even places like the Baseball Hall of Fame are really just now starting to appreciate what they have. And, for many years, the Hall of Fame just wanted an image. If they had an image of Greg Kindler, they didn't care if it was a modern print, an old print. And I think they're just now starting to appreciate and protect, and categorize what they have in their inventory.
I think that's because weirdos like us keep
exactly.
Them and we're like, can you help me with this image? I know I'm guilty of that.
What does excite you guys the most? Is it the photography, like the way the photographer sets it up? Is it the player? Like when you see a truly great photo that gets you excited, what are the characteristics of that photo?
For me, it's kind of like it when you see it. It's almost an instantaneous reveal that it's seeing it at a setting. Or I think Greg and I both have an appreciation for the play of light and the toning in the images. That you can have multiple copies of the same images, and sometimes I see a copy and say, "Wow, I've never seen it printed quite this sharp, this clear, or cropped in this certain way." And so, just the quality of the clarity and contrast on the picture is sometimes interesting, and just different positions and something that is out of the ordinary. Too many of them are just a standard, the guy sitting there holding his bat or playing like he's trying to catch a ball, or a pitcher, stopped in mid-delivery to pose. Those don't really speak to me in the same way as some of the more candid shots. Like one of my favorite shots is two catchers in about 1910, with a big tobacco sign. They're sitting there on the field with a ladder behind them they're leaning against and leaves on the field. And it kind of captures that. It evokes the era, and to me, that's what it kind of catches me. As I mentioned, a time machine for photographs, anything that transports me back, that I feel like I'm there witnessing the image. That's what kind of grabs me.
Greg, what about you?
I mean, I'm kind of the same way, and I've noticed that my taste for imagery or what kind of gets me off, it changes throughout time. I mean, when I was when I first started doing these paintings, the stuff that really attracted me was action, and just action. And I didn't really portraits didn't really do anything for me. They didn't really excite me in any way. And then eventually that changed. I started to really get into portraits, and then I'm like, okay, well, portraits outside in the ballpark, they can't be studio portraits. But then later on, I'm thinking, oh, I like studio portraits too. They each have their own place, I think, in my heart. But also like Jim, it's like you do. There is something that is kind of intangible. That kind of if it can evoke that kind of nostalgia, that idea of time travel. I think that kind of makes the image transcendent. But at the same time, an image that I love might not be an image that Jim loves. And I think that in our world, you see photos, some of these photographs that go for these insane. We're talking high six-figure dollar values in auctions, and you could ask Jim like whether he would like that image or whether I would like that image. And like, that's all right. Nothing special about it. Here's another image of the same player, taken from a different angle, different day or whatever. This one's gorgeous and sold for a fraction of the price. So that stuff is completely subjective.
We can't completely lose the fact that our judge friend just said, "I know it when I see it." By the way, and little hilarity on the judge decision thing. So thanks for that.
Oliver Wendell Holmes quote. Yes.
Yeah. I was going to show you guys a picture of my football playing grandfather, and what's amazing to me about this picture, look, it's my grandpa, so of course I like it. But just a guy standing on the sidelines covering junior college football, but he gets this amazing photo. Maybe it wasn't the most amazing play of the game, but there that thing is, right? And so, the thing that's always amazing to me is if you don't grab that picture of Don Norton and tell a story about it, it really doesn't exist. I mean, yes, it's in an archive somewhere, but who's going to look up Chafee 1941 football season? It's just not going to happen, right? And so there is, I don't know, I feel a responsibility, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong about this, to go, you know what, no, slow down and tell June Green's story. He's a Major League Baseball player, one of those weird ones I was talking about before. Because if you don't do it, really no one else ever is, and the person no longer exists, even though there's this record of them somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, speaking from my point of view, there is a responsibility, and there's the idea of kind of making those people relevant. Again, it's kind of, obviously no one is going to be immortal, but you kind of get to live beyond the grave in that sense, which I think is cool. And at the same time, I'm also very sensitive. So, I would think, if there's like just a random utility player, from like the 20s or whatever that played on like 5 different teams that no one remembers or cares about. Like in my head, I'm always like, well, that person had a family and I know his family cared about him.
Yeah.
So, in that way, it's like, that person is worth, in my world, he's worth painting.
Yeah. And your question hit upon really the real reason that I wrote this book is I recognized just how unknown these stories of these photographers and press agencies were, and that the knowledge was out there. It had to be ferreted out. And, there's a lot of major collectors that are contributors to my book, and everyone has their own pocket of knowledge, but no one could see the entire field. And I realized that having access to these collectors that are very advanced and being able to collaborate with them and pull all that information together and to vet it. Quite honestly, I haven't had any fact correction on my book. And I think that's largely because I've gone out to my panel of experts and submitted everything for vetting, and we've debated it. And if I didn't feel reasonably confident, I wouldn't put it in there. But I realized that if I didn't tell this story and tell it now, it may go untold. And so for me, that was a large part of it, was preserving and honoring all these photographers and even some of the obscure players that are in the book, and kind of recognizing it and setting it forth so that, hopefully in the future that someone can look back at the book and have easy access to that information. And then, like I say, this was the first pass at it. I could see, I hope that in the decades to come that someone else would follow up and be able to dive even deeper or discover new photographers and new images.
Do you say someone else because you don't want to do it anymore? You've had enough?
No, I'm just saying realistically, I mean, I would love to do a second edition, but I'd have to feel like I had enough to add to make it a true second edition, with something revelatory. And that'll take years. I haven't restarted really a lot of the research. I'd love to do it, but I'm just saying, I view this as a decades long play. I hope that this book becomes kind of a industry standard, and anyone's interested in the era or collecting, 20 or 30 years will still pull it out as a reference. And at some point, because my book was in essence an update and an expansion of Henry E. Marshall Vogel Khyber Oser's, book from about 20 years ago on baseball photography and expansion. And so I'm saying is, if I don't do it, I hope someone else will pick up the baton and do it, at a later date. Hopefully I'm there, and hopefully I'm able to contribute and do it again.
I don't know if you guys realize this, but Billy the Kid was forgotten. He got found by a press guy going back in time, going, let me find a great cowboy story. And so they resurrected this guy who was buried, gone, and forgotten, no knowing anything about him. And you look at what happens, and he's indelible now, right? He went from gone to, we all know that name, even though the guy hasn't been alive in, maybe 100 years, maybe more, right?
Right.
Yeah. Same thing with, like Moonlight Graham. I mean, he's an obscure name in a book, and Kinsella discovers that, and the movie happens, and now it's like Moonlight Graham's story is a romantic thing that has kind of brought him back to life, even though this guy, played an inning or two.
But his memorabilia goes for sky high prices, just right? The nostalgia and the rediscovery there.
Yeah, the stethoscope kind of. Yeah. That it is amazing what sticks and what doesn't. Another great example of this, my buddy Jim wrote a fantastic book about the Pony Express. And the Pony Express was only around for 18 months. And so you think about like a year and a half, and this thing's gone. So he just takes a ride, and then the message is Lincoln is president, and just follows the ponies, and just kind of does all these rabbit hole little side stories, and it's remarkable. The book is just it's a snapshot of that time, and there's all these great little nuggets in there. But if Jim doesn't do that, the Pony Express is just this thing that we kind of know about, and we have no idea. Well, only was 18 months. It's amazing. And that look, we're not plugging Jim's book right now, but that book also it'll blow you away with the detail, because he goes out and goes on a lot of these, physically goes to these spots, and there's still the wagon ruts and some of the rocky trail. It's amazing that these stories are out there. That's
amazing. I mean, that stuff is important, I mean, like what Jim does is important. Like 50 years from now, some of us will be gone. And, I think names like Mickey Mantle and Babe Ruth will probably still be around. But I don't know. Chief Bender, how many people do you think are going to know who Chief Bender is, even though he's a Hall of Famer? I mean,
how many know him now? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like you keep these people alive for a bit longer, and that, I think, to me, that's really special.
I just had Steve Ditmore on, and he wrote a book. It's not even out yet, about Jim Gilliam. And when you look at Jim Gilliam's career, he will be forgotten at some point, right? Even though he's in the Ring of Honor and numbers retired for the Dodgers, but he went back and he used newspapers and all these other resources to really do a great laydown of him. And then also before that, I had Tim Manners on the show, and he wrote a fantastic book with a guy who's been dead for 40 years, Waite Hoyt. And he took Waite's unfinished autobiographies in all their different forms and smushed them together and made this brilliant book about this guy that, has been dead for 40 years and had this amazing life. And it's remarkable that these stories are out there being told. Do any of these kind of stories that you guys come across stand out for you guys? I've been talking about Waite Hoyt and Jim Gilliam, but what about you guys?
For me, and it was Greg painting the Chief Bender. When I got back into collecting, I started, and I probably have 40 or 50 photos of him. But Chief Bender he was interesting to me in that he was Native American, a Hall of Famer on the World Series teams, but still fairly obscure. That you could affordably find his photos and be able to kind of collect and just kind of tell the story. And his career ran the gamut from 1903 to 1917, which is kind of square totally within the dead ball period. And just fascinating kind of backstory on him and the achievements that he made. I kind of that's one of those little stories that I like to preserve.
Yeah, Greg.
I mean, I'm very partial to a lot of those subjects. The subjects that are kind of forgotten. The Negro League and Latin American League players mean a lot to me. I mean, for that very same reason. These are businesses that thrived in their era, and players who who obviously just weren't given a chance to play in the bigs just because of the color of their skin, which you look back on that now and think how disgusting, but back then it was still very much like segregation was a thriving business, which is insane. But yeah, there's such a romance to calling it a romance is kind of disgusting too. But to me, I'm very interested in those players, and I love painting them because I love giving the opportunity to giving other people the opportunity to learn about them, and to maybe start to realize that we really did miss a lot.
So for your commissions on more obscure players, is that more interesting than you? I mean, obviously you could paint nonstop Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, Christy Mathewson ad nauseum, but do you find more pleasure or discovery of our challenge on painting some of the more obscure?
The politically correct answer is that I treat every painting like it's. I do treat every painting like it's going to be the best in the world. But I really get off more on the obscure people, or if it is a Babe Ruth, or if it is Lou Gehrig or whatever. If it's an obscure image, I'll get off on that. Like with Lou Gehrig, I think most people who ask me to do something of him, it's usually something from like his farewell. So in my head, it's like, all right, if you want me to paint Lou Gehrig and it's not an image from his farewell, already I'm very interested in painting it, just for that, because it's something that a lot of people don't see. It's amazing that he's remembered more for how he left the game than anything else. But yeah, on the Negro League stuff and Latin American League stuff, and even like the women's baseball stuff, I love it. I have such a.
It comes through in your work so admirably, and I'd probably suggest to any consignor working with you, share multiple images with Greg. Let him help select, because if he's passionate about it, you're going to get a first class work no matter what. But if you pick one that he really loves and that you really love, that passion is just going to shine through in the finished product.
That's true. Everything you paint, Greg, is so great. I want to sneak one more question in, and just because we like to take in time machine players, like, well, if Aaron Judge played in 1915, he would have destroyed a baseball, kind of thing. But when you get into the text and you realize just how hard life was, like I love the story of Rube Wahlberg chucking coal at his brother's, coal plant in Seattle, having come from Minnesota, is in the Coast Guard. He is like 31 when he fully arrives in the major leagues. That story's not spoiled. That's how hard life was, and there's just all these stories of someone had a miasma. We don't know what happened to him, So when you think about players back in the early part of the 1900s, the late part of the 1800s, what are your thoughts in terms of just staying alive versus even getting to the major leagues? Because that to me is fascinating, Jim.
And that's a very interesting question, and I put it in the context of I often get the deadball players, how would they fare in today's world? And I always say I don't know that that's a fair question. I think for me the answer lies more in any era. Compare players to players that were within their era. And when Babe Ruth is hitting 60 home runs and the next guy's hitting maybe 20, what is that gap differential? And I think that's really when they stand out that far amongst their immediate peers, that tells you what type of athlete and what type of skill set. Does it translate perfectly to the modern game with, not necessarily, but
right.
I think that you need to appreciate them from what they were in their era.
Yeah. And I would add to that, geography matters too. If you look at the number of players that come out of, say, Nevada, it pales to New York, right? And so you really can't jump them back in time or forward in time because they played in the time that they played, and that was already a miracle that any person gets to the major leagues.
Well, and you also have to realize too, in that day and age, there were no foreign players that were involved. There was only a subset, of the population that was even eligible to be in a major, so that you were dealing with a much more
Right.
limited field than what we face today with international and basically access for all.
Right. Right. Yeah. Greg, any thoughts on that before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes try to think in those terms where I'm, kind of comparing players and trying to imagine how they would do in other eras. My problem, I mean, I agree with Jim wholeheartedly on the fact that you do kind of have to compare them to the competition that they faced. But I kind of get caught up, like what you said about what life was like back then. I go back to like thinking about like Marty Bergen, who was this catcher for the Boston Beaneaters. I think he was one of the better defensive catchers of his era, and he's remembered today as a guy who had some mental issues, and he ended up murdering his children and his wife before committing suicide. And you're like, wow, I mean, life was like that back then, that you wouldn't necessarily, receive the kind of psychiatric help that you could get today. It's very different. I mean, even what's funny is that the photographs that that Jim would collect or that I would paint, you can even see some of this stuff in the players' faces. I mean, I don't know if I'm like projecting their pathos into it or what, but even seeing 22-year-old ball players with these short brimmed hats with crazy crow feet, like, oh my God, why do you look like you're 50 years old and your skin is made out of leather? I mean, it's just different. It's different back.
Yeah. Anything in closing before we wrap this up? But I'll let you start, Greg, and we'll get Jim on the backside.
Just two things. One, I want to apologize for bringing up murder and suicide in your podcast.
That's all right. We covered that yesterday.
But two, just that if anybody is interested in baseball photography in any capacity, I think getting your hands on Jim's book is a must. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right, there's the link for that. Jim, you have the floor, and wrap us up.
Yes, I so appreciate the opportunity to visit with the two of you, and I love with Greg and I just bouncing the creativity and the ideas and the concepts is just fascinating conceptually to me, and I really appreciate the opportunity for each of us to share our passion. Mine for the research. Greg has a true talent and the artistry, but I would highly recommend that just go onto his site, gregkrimler.com, and look at the works. He's got a lot of his small and large works up there, and I think you will just be stunned. In fact, sometimes you'll think, is this a photograph or is it an actual painting?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's for sure. All right, let me roll these credits. I'll come back and say goodbye to you guys.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching the Break It Down Show.